right, I have a lot of graphics, I have a lot of figures. I'll probably move through the intensive graphs and figures and just kind of talk about them instead. Give you guys something to look at, but also try to educate you a little bit about not what necessarily climate change is going to do to the interior, but actually what already is occurring here. So I'm not going to show and talk about wildfires and their increasing potential over time as climate change exacerbates them. I'm really just going to talk about them as they act now in the natural environment in Florida. And as my presentation describes, I'm talking about the resiliency of developments and the resiliency of fire-dependent ecosystems, both of them, not one or the other. And so if you look at fire just as a national, regional, and state level issue, you'll see that it affects everything and everyone. In Florida, about our last major wildfire season was about in 1998. And some of you self-identified as having worked in Florida for a long time. And you can understand that in 1998, there was a series of catastrophic fires, one of which occurred in north central Florida between May and June. It required the work of over 400,000 firefighters from over 47 different states and contributed to both a natural resource and a developed and built environment damage of about $620,000, which at the time was pretty excessive. I'm sorry, $620 million. But this exact same wildfire that caused so much catastrophic damage also affected Florida's wildlife and flora and fauna in a very positive way. After this 1998 fire, you saw the population of Florida's Rugal pawpaw, a federally endangered species, increase from 200 individuals to over 2,000 individuals. So it's this very interesting dynamic that fire in one instance can be so catastrophic and damaging, yet in an entirely other instance is actually doing a lot of environmental good. And this is really kind of the roadmap that I'm going to take today. I've already given a little bit of introduction, and I'm going to go into a key concept that will kind of weave its way throughout my entire presentation. I'll give you a little bit about who I am, a little bit more about why I'm here and what I do. And then I'm going to jump right into the issue in Florida, give you all a little bit of background, which I'm sure you all already know and are aware of. And then I'm going to jump right into what our project focused on, what our research process was, and what some of the outcomes of that process were. So the main thing that I'm going to define for you all today is resiliency planning. It's the new sustainability, the new techie term to use. And in my case, it's largely misunderstood. Resiliency planning at its basis is the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and still retain its basic function and structure. Jack Ahern a couple years ago described resiliency as this way of how planners like to draw an outline and make static landscapes in what is really a dynamic environment. So we like to create areas. We like to outline our conservation areas, outline our developed space, and then assume that that's going to be resilient in a landscape that is largely dynamic. And this is more or less wrong. A lot of the focus of my work has been on how interior counties in Florida can be resilient to wildfires, but also how those landscapes can be resilient in themselves. When a lot of people think about wildfires, they think about this. They think about wildfires getting and growing in their backyards and encroaching onto their invested property, into their livelihoods. But what I want people to look at when they think of wildfires is their resilient ability to respond to a fire and then regenerate. Fire has this amazing thing that goes through the landscape, and this is an area in Florida just north of Gainesville where there was 14 years of built-up fuels or vegetation. A wildfire came through this area, and within 3 weeks, this is what it looked like in the bottom. All the plants were regenerating, the trees were responding, the soils and the soil life was regenerating, and in fact, the local neighborhood here was able to be resistant to this wildfire because fuels treatments have been taken care of beforehand to bring that fuel down and to make it safe for both the people and the environment. This is the kind of resiliency that I'm going to be speaking about for the majority of this presentation. So who I am, I already mentioned that I'm a PhD student at the University of Florida. I was wonderfully introduced that my background is in wildlife ecology, and for the last 3 years I've focused mostly at planning at the regional scale. And for the regional scale for me is the state level in Florida. When I started, I had two options really for my approach. It would either be focus on wetlands or focus on more fire-dependent systems. And I opted for fire sheds because I'm a long-term planner. A lot of my friends who did some amazing work with climate change adaptation strategies in Florida were looking at what's already occurring and a lot of the policy that's involved, but not a lot of work has been done at looking at Florida's fire sheds, which is, I hope, a term that you walk away from here today remembering. So what I do is I embrace this kind of idea of a public-private partnership. Both am a researcher at UF, but I also independently went out into my local area, in this case in Gilchrist County, and found a landholder with over 28,000 acres that was interested in development, but also very strongly interested in keeping the idea of iconic Florida alive. And this is the kind of work that I've tried to continue to do. And one way of doing that is I myself am a wildland firefighter. I go out into the environment, into Lower Swanee National Wildlife Refuge, and I help them with their fire management so that I can understand the ecology of fire as it behaves in Florida and use that to inform decisions at the policy level. So that's a little bit about me. And for those of you who want to know a little bit of the background in Florida, our population is growing. This is a very basic chart, but it can obviously show the exponential increase of our population in the state of Florida. Now this is something that was released by the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs at the University of Florida, showing Florida's current density of urban areas, as well as our more, I think I jumped ahead, nope, okay. This is, on the left-hand side, an area of Florida in 1949, and what that coast looks like now, currently. And this is pretty much the exact same image if you start anywhere from Crystal River and swing all the way back and around to Jacksonville. Is you see this kind of destruction of the wetlands on our coast, and instead we put these very, again, static pieces of built land use into our coastal areas, which has caused all this vulnerability. And if you now look at this out to 2060, which some of you may have seen this before, all the area in green is permanently reserved or conserved landscape, and the area in red on the left is the current dense urban city populations in Florida. And on the right-hand side, you see what that is going to look like in 2060. You see that encroachment into the interior part of Florida from both sides. You see that development along most of our corridors, that's I-4, Alligator Alley, I-75, US 95, and currently they are revising this forecast to show what the impact is of coastal climate change and how sea level rise is going to actually exacerbate and increase this amount of dense development that we see in the interior part of Florida. Now, again, what I'm going to talk to you all about today is not just wildfire and how wildfire affects developments, but also Florida's fire-dependent ecosystems. And to do this, I'm going to talk about the movement of fire in the landscape and the movement of wildlife. I did this for two reasons. Number one, a lot of people like Florida black bears. A lot of people don't like them. A lot of people love that they exist in our environment, that we have these large-ranging wildlife like black bears, panthers, even Florida scrub jays I would throw into that mix, that depend on fire-dependent systems. And the unique thing is that in Florida, any ecosystem can be determined by two things: the depth to the water table and the fire return interval. So how frequently that fire comes back into those landscapes. And in the central part of Florida, that range can be 1 to 7 years, but that range can also be every 1 to 100 years, as it is in the case of the Ocala National Forest. So I wanted to look at the movement of wildlife as a way of looking at how things besides us use the landscape and how their movement is going to be affected by our development. But I also wanted to use wildfire as the example because it's something that kind of speaks back at our development. Whereas wildlife it's kind of manifested in the idea of collisions with our vehicles. Wildfires, the manifestation is really that our houses burn down, our businesses burn down, and our general environment faces these catastrophic emergencies. So it's a little bit of a power play between the two, and so you'll see how I use both of these in this one case study in Florida. Now, before I get into that, I wanted to get a little bit of background for you guys on what you're going to see happen as we look at this development design. You're going to see a couple of things. This area on the left-hand side really starts looking more at landscape connectivity and the connectivity of both fuels for wildfire as well as natural systems for wildlife to move through our matrix of developed space. You see things like this happening all over Florida, where you have an area starting out as it is on the left, and you see little parts of perforation, you see fragmentation, you see desiccation, where we run power lines through our natural areas. We see areas of attrition, where after we've built an area, what we thought was our conserved natural space, even our wetlands, our edge effect begins to narrow down the amount of actual resilient communities, whether they're fire or water dependent. And you see these manifested as we create new development in Florida. There's been some really great work done by both Randall Ardent previously, as well as some very good landscape architects and planners in Florida, Canaan and Associates. And we're beginning to get an idea about how to do this. From Randall Ardent, you can see that this same area in the top left, which has a certain amount of dwelling units per acre, is realized on the right-hand side with less environmental degradation. And on the bottom, you can see this master plan for restoration in Florida. That's a city, not a approach. And what the original plan was, with a very sprawled development along that coastal community, and instead, they, again, maintain the same amount of dwelling units, but densified against the coast. So where the coast may now be a little more susceptible to that damage, this interior portion here is largely connected, it's intact, and it keeps the wildlife away from the city and allows the more disturbance processes like wildfire to actually behave as they should naturally, with less exposure to our developed areas. So I'm going to skip this and come back to this later on during the question and answer part, because it's a little more about how our planning strategies have revolved in Florida and how, though we originally focused on water, it's now coming back around to bite us and nip at us because we don't yet have plans in place to deal with our wildfire in the heart of Florida. And again, I'm going to come back to this because you'll see this kind of become a realized truth in our research example that I'm going to provide to you. So again, the main purpose of this research was twofold: to compare development designs for their impact on the resiliency of wildlife movement, and secondly, to rank proposed development designs from most to least resilient to wildfire. Those are the two main questions that I'm going to try to answer by walking you all through this. This is the property that we focused on for our work in the last 2 years. It's located in Gilchrist County, Florida. And I'm going to start by passing this around in the back. It will give you a little bit more information on the urban design approach that this class took, as well as some of the reasons for why they began, thank you, for why they took this very interesting approach to development design for this community. This property is one single pine plantation located in this area of Florida called the Wakasasa Flats, which runs up here north, down through where Cedar Key is kind of here on the coast. You have the Lower Swanee National Wildlife Refuge, where I do my firefighting work, here in the corner. And you can see that this is not a coastal community at all. And in fact, the closest city here would be Trenton, Florida, which, if any of you have driven through before, it's very, very slightly a city, but nevertheless, it is still a city in Florida, and it would be largely impacted by a development on the scale of 28,000 acres as we have here. Now, Canaan and Associates originally came out with this plan in about 2007, 2008, which involves some features which I'll go into, such as club homes in the northern part of the area, a airstrip for a small-scale airport, as well as biomedical and technical research parks, mixed-use town centers located on SR 27 here, as well as 3 different golf courses for that community, and the idea of a light rail running from there to Gainesville, Florida. After 2008 and our wonderful small financial crisis, the idea of this type of plan kind of became a little too far-fetched. And a lot of the major shareholders and stakeholders interested in this property had this idea that they wanted to maintain what they thought was an iconic ideal of Florida. They currently do a lot of hunting here, as well as having a sustainable forestry operation here. And many of the people who are partial owners of this property had read several really great books by some amazing authors in Florida that wanted to kind of look at that ability to develop in a natural part of Florida, but keep the historical context alive. So this was the thought process that 3 different design groups went through in coming up with 3 different developments for this property. The major problem here in the Waukesasa Flats is water. About half of this property is located beneath a 100-year floodplain, and so to begin making this development, each of the 3 groups said, we're not going to develop in the 100-year floodplain, and what else is left? From that remaining developed space, they were able to look at it and say, how could we connect all of these developable pieces of property? And so they kind of did a maximum development scenario where they tried to connect every parcel of this land, giving it about a 1-acre lot, by roadway. And in the end, they realized that it would cost about $250 million just to put in a roadway network connecting all of these developable parcels, and instead decided to scale back, look at what was actually a smart and more practical development size, and then bring in some of these environmental context clues that I've spoken about, such as the movement of wildlife in the landscape and the need for fire in the landscape, and use these elements to dictate the final areas where they would come up with some of these smart growth, new urbanism style developments. And this was the general process that all 3 groups used. And then after this, they were each allowed to go independently and create their own development with independent and, I guess you would say, different geospatial distributions of education centers, low, medium, and high residential areas. There are environmental areas such as parks and conserved space. Some of them came up with very unique things like HOA camps, dog hunting courses. A lot of them had urban, these kind of new urbanism style centers. A lot of them did bring in a lot of the tech industry and how they could have very large commercial centers. And I'll just briefly showcase these, and there's, again, more detail in the book that I'm sending around. But here is one of the group designs. In red, you can see the commercial space. Each of these areas in pale are the high, medium, and low density residential. And then this green area here was what they were calling kind of their buffer space. So their environmental lands that they were going to leave as parks and as conserved space. And then this area was left completely intact. This would be group 2's design. Again, small area of commercial here and here. A large city center here with, again, those low, medium, and high residential areas located throughout the property. And they took the idea of wildlife planning a little differently, saying that by creating these areas here and over here, that they create pockets of open space for their wildlife to occupy. And this would be the 3rd group's design. Again, a small area of low density residential and an HOA camp on this corner. And then their environmental education center located here next to some commercial areas. And again, that low, medium, and high density residential area. Then it was the fun part for me. This is the point in the research where I took 2 different approaches. I used GIS to look at the wildlife movement as well as to look at the wildfire movement. For the wildlife movement, I focused on the Florida black bear. I wanted a large-ranging species that had particular environmental needs and that was readily available to model in this landscape. And to do so, I looked at a couple inputs. We used topographic features, so again, that proximity to water, both vertical and horizontal proximities. We looked at vegetated land uses and previously developed space, such as Trenton and Bell, Florida. And then we also looked at the density of the roadway network. And then almost all of those worked perfectly in our wildfire simulators, which we ran to fictitiously burn down these developments. And to do so, we again looked at the topography, the elevation, the slope, the aspect of the land, and how that would change the fuels that carried fire across the landscape. We looked at the same vegetation and land use for how much of that land was available for wildfire to move through. And this required the development of a couple fuel models, which I'll go into in a second. And lastly, again, that major roadway network and how those major county roads would help guide and move the fire as it went through, as well as how any new development might change the movement of that fire. And luckily, that weather information was available from the Western Regional Climate Center, and we could use that to look back over the last 20 years of available data and identify low, medium, and high intensity wildfire scenarios. So that would, your high being more like a hurricane comes through, where you have high winds, low pressure, low moisture, and your low intensity wildfire scenarios being kind of late winter, where you have relatively high humidity levels, you have rather abundant water, and what that different scenario might look like. So we'll get right into it, and we'll present the black bear corridor information first, and then we'll go into the wildfire information a little bit more. To begin, this is the resulting corridor created by each of the three developments. In the more light yellow, that is obviously the same across all three, and what you're seeing there is the current existing corridor as dictated by the current landscape. In purple, rather than in red, as you saw earlier, you have your urban land uses or your high-intensity agriculture, which are not as conducive to wildlife movement. And then in your green, your light yellow going to green, you have your much more highly valued components of the landscape that a black bear might depend on. So you can see that each of these three after corridors in orange resulted a little differently. And each of these is really no more than a result of that development and its impact on this corridor for black bear movement. The unique thing is that after completing this work at the end of 2013, they actually had their first black bear on the property in about 25 years. And it actually followed this land up in the northern part of the county and then entered the Gilchrist Clubs area here and followed this corridor just about flawlessly, about within 250 yards the entire way through. So this is a zoomed in portion of that same corridor, looking at just the site scale here. And what you see are some very interesting things. Obviously, Group 3 had the lowest impact on that corridor by having most of their development or their intense development clustered on the western side of the property. And regardless, in each of these three scenarios, they were able to achieve the same amount of conserved space, roughly, with the same amount of developed space. So each of these three groups conserved about 80% of the 28,000 acres while developing only about less than 20% of that property. Some of the unique things that came from this are, for example, right here and down here in the corner, as well as right there. You see that the corridor actually tries to go around some of these developed areas. And this is what I was referring to before as the availability of some very nice pieces of this landscape that might be conducive to black bear movement, but with the encroachment of development, these actually might manifest in vehicular collisions with a black bear or any of the other large-ranging terrestrial wildlife that we have in the interior part of Florida. This also became very unique because you can see in group 1 here that this, what we like to call a bottleneck in a corridor, is where this wide range of space, which was about 2.03 or 2.33 miles wide originally, in the end for group 1 was only about 1.5 miles, or I'm sorry, they lost 1.5 miles, leaving about 0.5 to 0.75 miles of width for a black bear to move through in this landscape. That's awful. We can just leave it at that. That's really terrible. The amount of development that moved in towards this interior part of the Waukesha Flats, which had never occurred there before, has a very strong influence on shifting that corridor east. And again, the edge effects of that development most likely would even push that a little bit further east. Again, told you we'd skip over the figures, so I'm going to save everyone those. And I'll get right into the fuel models. So this creating fuel information is not an easy task. As you saw in that picture a couple slides ago, it required me going out to over 100 different points, stratified in both upland areas and wetland areas, again designated by that 100-year floodplain. And at random areas across the entire property, I got on my hands and knees and measured the fuel. The fuel would be the tons per acre of available vegetation, and this includes measuring the amount of the percent cover of vegetation. It includes measuring the amount of twigs, less than, let's say, your finger, the amount of branches, let's say about 2 fingers, and the amount of logs or other large pieces of woody debris about the size of your fist, and then extrapolating that across the entire property. And once we created each of these 2 different fuel models, we subtracted each from each other. So from the upland area, we subtracted the wetlands, from the wetlands, the uplands, and then merged them together to create our final fuel model for this entire property. Creating about 19 different areas of vegetation, each of these classified. One of them worth mentioning is this swath of red going across would be your very xeric scrub, sandhill, pine flatwoods type ecosystem, prevalent in much of this heart of Florida's area as you move west and east into the Lake Wales Ridge. I'm sorry. So here, let me go back once just to make sure this works. All right, so here you'll see that actual growth of the wildfire. It may not be able to see it quite immediately here in the corner, but this is our high intensity, high fuel content fire scenario. And here in the bottom right, you'll see this actually progressing through the development in what is about 2-hour lapses. So within the first 15 hours, about 2,000 acres of this 28,000 acres had burned. And again, the wildfire will continue to spread across that as I continue to talk. Now, as you see these white bands, those are nothing more than the 2-hour timestamps of that wildfire's flaming front moving across the landscape. And where you see these pockets where that line densifies on itself, that's nothing more than the progression of the wildfire slowing down. So those 2-hour timestamps begin to coincide with each other, and you see a little bit more concentric development, but then you'll again see them push across as the wildfire continues to grow. These simulated wildfires were started at areas that had previously experienced wildfire, so we used real lightning strikes to position these and see what this behavior would look like. And I'll move ahead so that we can kind of get a better idea about what these looked like in the end. So unfortunately, I wasn't able, with any one single simulated wildfire, to burn down an entire development. The 28,000 acres was just a little too big, and it wasn't possible for me to do that. So instead, I did one on the western part of the property and one on the eastern part to create these final fuel models and their resulting wildfires. You can see each of the wildfires covers most of the property. And if you look at this, this is a better image of what the flame height of that wildfire is as it moves across the landscape. So these areas in blue are lower flame heights. So looking at 0.01 to 1 meter. And the areas in red, you're looking at 4.7 meters in length. It's roughly 12 to 15 feet if you can't do the conversion. And so we did these and compared them across each of the different development designs. What I want to focus your attention on more than anything else is these areas in purple that you see in the Group 2's designs. But before I move on, you can see that the low, the medium, and the high fire and scenarios each resulted in different flame lengths, different rate of spreads, and all of these are things that developments within these fire-dependent systems will have to be able to capacitate in the long term if a development like this is actually possible. Now, the unique thing about Group 2, as I mentioned before, Group 2 created that large urban center, and they chose to do this because this area where their development was originally placed is actually located on what they saw as very poor conditioned parts of the landscape. So when they pulled up the land cover information provided by the FGDL, the Florida Geographic Data Library, what they saw was this area of bare soil. And they said, this area is already ready and primed for development. We'll focus most of our development on this location and not concentrate on the rest. And you can see that the wildfire, this again is using the high intensity fire scenario, it actually progressed right up to their development and then ceased. So you have these very high fuel loads, and again, if you can't see in the back, I apologize, but you see these very high fuel loads of about 12 to 15 feet next to an area that did not even register in the simulator. So the result of this is what I like to, it took me a while to come up with this, but I'm going to read you a poem that actually defines this as best as I possibly could. It's an Oliver Goldsmith poem that was used in a case several years ago now to kind of create an understanding for what occurred. So the Oliver Goldsmith poem is Retaliation. It was used in an 1879 case in Georgia, Lee versus Porter, and it went something like this. The pupil of impulse, it forced him along, his conduct still right, with his argument wrong. Still aiming at honor, yet fearing to roam, the coachman was tipsy, the chariot drove home. This poem discusses a drunk chariot driver, let's say a taxi driver, and his decision to drive the chariot home for his master. His conduct was right, and his argument, his decision to drive home, was completely incorrect. And this is actually the case for Group 2. They chose this area of bare soil as a really prime spot to develop because they were informed incorrectly. In fact, this area of the property, which much of it looks like this, is a 3,000-acre swath of this property that is managed on a one-year burn rotation. So every year, all 3,000 acres are burned. And it's because they hunt and manage quail on this property. One of the results of this is that this area of the property has a larger floral and fauna biodiversity content than any other part of the property. And if you do a ecosystem value, a transfer value to this area, looking at just three things: aesthetics, habitat conservation, and water retention, you see that each acre of this piece of the property actually has an ecosystem service value of about $1,600, which again, I'll do the math for you. That's about $2.8 million that this piece of property alone contributes to the natural environment instead of us having to do that. So they chose this piece of property because they were told that it was bare soil and barren and really readily developable, but in fact, it would have the most severe impact on the wildlife and the fauna and the flora of this area, but it also surprisingly contributed to a decrease in the vulnerability of this group's design to a wildfire, creating this conclusion that they had the correct decision but for the wrong reasons and became the most resilient to wildfire. One of the take-home messages from this is that creating the ability in policy for fire to exist on the landscape before developments are brought into the picture is a really great way of protecting our developable space in the interior part of Florida in the long run from these catastrophic wildfires. Unfortunately, right now in the state of Florida, only 1 out of our 4 our resiliency initiatives at the state level include fire at all. And when it is included, it's only in Florida's emergency management plan. There is actually not a single resiliency initiative in Florida, as there are for coastal communities and wetlands, to cater to the existence of fire sheds in the landscape. It's one of the main points that I wanted to drive at, is that by including fire as part of the discussion and as part of the policy, we can actually support our environment in the interior part of Florida while contributing to safe development designs. One of the other conclusions that I'll throw out there is that development really is a joint public-private partnership, and I was so happy that you mentioned that before. This would not have been possible without a public and private landowner reaching out to a student and a researcher at a public institution for assistance. They didn't have the technical expertise to move forward, and they didn't know how they could maintain the value of their decisions in any kind of development design. And so they brought someone in with more knowledge to contribute to their understanding and to their end result. They haven't decided to move forward with any of these 3 designs, but instead they're using it as a way of visioning what their future might look like. One of the last things I'll mention is that it became very relevant in this work that the 100-year floodplain is this kind of white elephant in the room. That in a development design, we address the 100-year floodplain and we say, we're not going anywhere near that. And I can't say and stand up here and say that we should develop in the 100-year floodplain. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm not going to say that fire is better than water, but that just as the ecosystems in Florida are determined by both fire and water, we shouldn't develop leaning away from the wetland areas and focusing our development on our upland, very endangered and very endemic uplands in Florida, and instead should seek a balance between our watershed planning and our fireshed planning as the amount of development in the interior part of Florida continues into our future. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you guys for listening. I do appreciate it. And I'll take a couple questions if you want now, and we can reserve the rest for the end.
Did the conclusions of your research look into what existing communities can do to improve their wildfire or wildlife resiliency?
That's actually the next step that my research is taking. Over the next 2 years, I've been asked to kind of step back even further and look at both state and national level on what information is available for wildfire potential, because that information is available, and how it's been used in the past. So if they do have these 20 to 30 years of modeling information about where these very vulnerable areas are for wildfire, where these heavy fuels are built up, I want to look at now how communities that already exist have used them successfully, or even the failures, and then ask the questions about why. So why did they choose to use them? Who informed them at the beginning? Why didn't they use them if it was available, and how their community suffered for it? And then look at that nationally and see where have these successes been and where have they not been, and what barriers existed, was it a state level issue or not, to prepare some of these fire adapted communities, or fire-wise communities as they're called, from wildfire. It's something that hasn't been done yet, and it seems very smart for where this project is going. And these developers, they did bring in a lot of the county and city commissioners from Trenton and Bell and Gilchrist County to get at some of that information of their emergency management strategies, how they're planning for future development in the area. And so all of that was used to inform the development designs before they actually were created. Yeah.
Scott, this may be relevant to a slide that I have in my presentation, but and I may have missed it. Did you address a changing climate with your fire models?
So mine did not. I wanted to stay away from looking at what fire potential might increase with climate change. My focus was far more to look at how would a current development respond to the current fire regime in that area.